Rooted deeply in these lands, the Mohawks of Kanesatake have fought colonization for decades, clinging on to their identity and rights. But in the summer of 1990, their ancestral bonds would be tested in ways that would echo through history. There were three parties involved, but the two main parties were the town of Oka and the Kanesatake Mohawks. The town of Oka decided that they wanted to expand their prestigious 9-hole golf course into an 18-hole golf course, but that would impede on a sacred burial site located in the area of the Pines. This leads me to the goal of the Kanesatake people. They wanted to keep the burial site remote and uninterrupted by construction and golfers, so that meant a blockade would be formed by the Kanesatake people. Due to the blockade, the police of Quebec were immediately sent, and the RCMP would later follow to remove it, so the town of Oka could expand the golf course. Ellen Gabriel, a Mohawk from Kanesatake, stood out as a key spokesperson for the Mohawk community during the Oka crisis. Trained as an artist and with no prior political role, Gabriel was chosen by her community to speak on their behalf because of her understanding and firm grasp of the issue at stake. Ellen Gabriel effectively communicated the perspectives and demands of the Mohawk community to the media and government bodies. She provided a calm and articulated voice during a tough time, helping to clarify the community's stance on land rights. Monique Horn-Miller was a 14-year-old Mohawk girl during the Oka crisis, who later became famous not only for her involvement in the crisis, but also as an athlete and advocate. During the crisis, Horn-Miller was stabbed near her heart by a soldier's bayonet, as she was holding her younger sister. This incident became one of the most dramatic moments of the standoff. She would later go on to become an Olympic water polo player for Canada. Jean Alouette served as the mayor of Oka during the Oka crisis in 1990. His decisions and leadership were central to the events that unfolded during this period. Mayor Alouette was a pivotal figure in the initiation of the crisis due to his strong support for the expansion of the golf course and the development on the contested land, which included the Mohawk burial ground. His administration's decision to approve these developments despite clear opposition from the Mohawk community sparked the initial protests and barricades. General John de Chastelain was the chief of the defense staff in Canada at the time of the Oka crisis. He was responsible for overseeing the Canadian forces' involvement in the crisis. John took a notably cautious approach to the military's involvement, advocating for restraint and negotiation over force. His leadership is credited with preventing further violence and facilitating a relatively peaceful resolution to the standoff. Ronald Cross, better known as his nickname Lasagna, was a Mohawk warrior leader during the Oka crisis. He was known for his charismatic leadership and was one of the more militant figures during the standoff. Cross played a central role in organizing the defense of the barricades and was a key military strategist for the Mohawks. His leadership helped to maintain the morale of the Mohawk warriors during the siege, warriors at the barricades during the Oka crisis, and later became a prominent leader within the Mohawk Council of Kanesatake. During the Oka crisis, Simon was actively involved in the defense strategies and negotiations with governmental authorities.
The Oka crisis kicked off on July 11, 1990, it unfolding over the course of 78 days. It all began with the Mohawk residents of Kanesatake setting up a peaceful blockade. Their goal was simple: to stop the nearby town of Oka from expanding a golf course over the ancestral burial grounds. However, what started as a local dispute quickly grew into a much larger conflict, drawing in the Quebec Provincial Police, known as the Sûreté de Québec, and eventually the Canadian Army.
Long-term causes. The conflict over land between the Mohawk people and settlers dates back centuries. Disputes were often poorly resolved or ignored, creating outstanding grievances. The Canadian system established to address Indigenous land claims are often slow and bureaucratic, leaving many claims, such as those by the Mohawks regarding Oka, unresolved and contentious. Additionally, the land involved was not just real estate, but held a significant cultural and spiritual value for the Mohawks, including burial grounds, which were not adequately respected or protected by the government in their plan to build the golf course. Another important factor was the broader backdrop of socio-economic marginalization. Despite having claim to this land, the Mohawk people received no money, which contributed to issues of poverty, lack of economic opportunities, and systemic discrimination. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, tensions had been building for decades over land rights in the Kanesatake area, with multiple claims and disputes over land use and ownership, but these were largely unresolved. By 1989, the Mohawk community of Kanesatake submitted a land claim for the pine forest that included their sacred burial ground, but it was not settled before the crisis erupted. Long-term issues came to a head when in March of 1990, the town of Oka planned to expand a golf course onto land that included a Mohawk burial site. This was viewed as a direct threat to the Mohawks' cultural heritage. Additionally, there was a complete lack of consultation with the Mohawk people, exemplifying a pattern of excluding indigenous stakeholders from decisions affecting their land. As a result of this blatant disrespect, the Mohawk community set up a peaceful blockade of a dirt road leading to the proposed expansion site of the golf course in an effort to halt construction. This is where the Kanesatake Resistance begins. On March 10th of 1990, the Mohawk Council of Kanesatake sent a letter to the mayor of Oka and the developer, outlining the importance of the land and requested a halt to development until land claims were resolved. From here, things only continued to escalate. On July 11, 1990, the early morning raid by the Surete de Quebec aimed to dismantle the Mohawk barricade using tear gas and concussion grenades, but this resulted in gunfire. The exact circumstances of the shooting that killed Corporal LeMay remain unclear, but this death significantly escalated the conflict. Police retreated, but returned about 3 hours later and staged a massive assault on the encampment with automatic weapons, stun grenades, and more tear gas. About 200 Mohawks, their face daubed with war paint and masks and bandanas, fought off repeated attacks over several hours, and they were later joined by about 100 women and children from the nearby Mohawk Reserve. On July 12, 1990, Mohawks from Kanawake, in solidarity with Kanesatake, blockaded the Mercier Bridge, a critical access point to Montreal, disrupting major traffic and drawing significant media attention. Not all of this attention was good. Because of the blockage of traffic, many people turned to racism and violence and turned against the Mohawks, which led to several incidents. By late July 1990, media coverage intensified and public sympathy in many quarters turned towards the Mohawks, particularly after incidents of violence and racism against Indigenous people were reported. Siege and standoff. August 8, 1990, a convoy of 75 cars driven by Mohawk supporters attempted to reach Kanesatake but was stopped by the police, leading to a clash. On August 14, 1990, the Canadian Armed Forces were deployed, not to dislodge the Mohawks, but to establish perimeters and reduce police responsibilities. This move was seen both as an attempt to de-escalate the situation and a show of federal authority. The involvement of the armed forces raised tensions but also provided a sense of stability, as their ability for negotiations were much greater than that of the police. Negotiations and attempts at resolution. August 20, 1990, negotiations begin, mediated by various federal officials, but progress is slow. By August 29, 1990, Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa announces that the Canadian Army will take over from the Quebec Provincial Police, leading to heightened tensions and international attention. Finally, after 6 months, on September 26th, the Mohawks at Kanesatake dismantled their barrier after negotiations promised a halt to the golf course expansion and respect for the burial site. After this, the Mercier Bridge and other blocked routes are gradually reopened after the Mohawks at Kanawake negotiate an end to their barricades. By November 28, 1990, the Kanesatake Resistance had finally ended, marking a historic victory for the Indigenous people. As a result of this, in 1991, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People is established in response to the crisis and other Indigenous issues in Canada. Despite the historic achievements of the people of Kanesatake, this was still not a complete victory. Despite halting progress on the golf course, they still did not own the land which was rightfully theirs.
The short-term effects of the Kanesatake Resistance is the increased awareness of Indigenous issues. The crisis brought national and international attention to the struggles of Indigenous communities in Canada, particularly regarding land rights and power. It highlighted the deep-rooted issues surrounding the treatment of Indigenous people and their land claims. Community impact. The Mohawk communities involved, especially in Kanesatake, experienced significant strain. The standoffs and blockades led to economic hardships, disrupted daily life, and increased tensions with neighboring non-Indigenous communities. Violence and arrests. The confrontation led to violent clashes between the Mohawk protesters and the Quebec police, and eventually the Canadian Army. One police officer was killed, many were injured on all sides, and there were numerous arrests of Mohawk protesters, which led to lasting irritation. Political repercussions. The crisis resulted in significant political fallout for both provincial and federal governments. It forced governments to reconsider their approaches to Indigenous land claims and sparked debates over the fairness of existing policies dealing with Indigenous rights. Strengthened Indigenous movements. The visibility and outcome of the Oka crisis empowered other Indigenous groups across Canada to assert their rights more forcefully, leading to increased activism and the initiation of more assertive land claim negotiations. Legislative and policy changes. In response to the crisis, there was a push to reform policies on Indigenous land claims and to improve the relationships between Indigenous peoples and various levels of government. This included more serious consideration of Indigenous rights in legislative frameworks. The long-term effects of the Kanesatake Resistance is it had legal and policy reforms. The crisis spurred significant reforms in policies related to Indigenous rights in Canada. It accelerated the process of land claims, negotiations, and led to more comprehensive federal policies on Indigenous self-governance and land rights. Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. In response to the Oka crisis and other tensions, the Canadian government established a Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1991. The commission aimed to address broader issues affecting Indigenous peoples, including land rights, governance, and living conditions. Its final report, published in 1996, provided extensive recommendations for changing the relationship between Indigenous peoples, the Canadian government, and Canadian society. Increased public awareness and support. The crisis raised public awareness about the issues faced by Indigenous communities in Canada. This increased awareness helped generate greater support from non-Indigenous Canadians for Indigenous rights and led to more educated public discussions about Canada's colonial history and its impacts. Strengthening of Indigenous movements. The Oka crisis had an invigorating effect on Indigenous movements in Canada. It inspired a new generation of Indigenous activism and leadership, which had continued to influence negotiations and interactions with the Canadian government. Cultural revitalization. Following the crisis, there was a notable increase in efforts towards cultural revitalization among Indigenous communities. This included more emphasis on language preservation, cultural education, and the strengthening of communities' practices that had been eroded by colonization. Changes in policing and military policy. The crisis led to changes in how Canadian police and the military handle conflicts involving Indigenous communities. There was a shift toward more negotiation and less confrontational approaches in managing disputes.
The Kanesatake Resistance stands as a reminder of the deep-seated conflicts that arise when the ancestral rights and cultural identities of Indigenous people collide with modern development interests. This event demonstrates the fundamental significance of land to Indigenous communities, not just as a physical space, but as an integral part of their cultural and spiritual heritage. The Kanesatake Resistance catalyzed a broader recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and land rights issues across Canada, prompting both national and international dialogue on how to approach Indigenous claims with the respect and seriousness they warrant. Furthermore, it highlighted the importance of reciprocity and sustainable use of the environment, emphasizing that development and progress must not come at the expense of disenfranchising those with ancient ties to the land. Reflecting on this, the Kanesatake Resistance serves as a critical lesson in the necessity of fostering respectful and informed relationships between Indigenous peoples and state authorities, assuring that mistakes of the past are not repeated in the future.